Welcome back to my channel and a happy Easter to you. This should be released on Easter Sunday. So since so much of what I do is connected to Jesus' resurrection, which is the reason for Easter Sunday, it can sometimes be a little hard to come up with something unique in a given year. This year, I've decided to talk about the appearance to James, Jesus' brother, which is mentioned in 1 Corinthians 15:7. Since the minimalist approach to arguing for the resurrection focuses so much on 1 Corinthians 15, and since neither the Gospels nor Acts mentions by name James as a person to whom Jesus appeared, and since the maximalist tends to emphasize the Gospels and Acts, it might seem that there's no such thing as a maximal facts approach that would use the appearance to James. Now, Acts definitely presents James, Jesus' brother or kinsman, as a very important leader in the Jerusalem church. That's there consistently, and he's mentioned as such also in the letters of the Apostle Paul. But in the narrative books, the Gospels and Acts, it doesn't mention that he allegedly saw Jesus or that he claimed that he saw Jesus after he rose from the dead. That's only mentioned in 1 Corinthians 15. 1 Corinthians 15, of course, as I'm often pointing out, is a summary. It doesn't tell stories. It doesn't give narratives. So we don't get an opportunity to see, how that might have gone, what it was exactly like. Did they have a meal together? Did they have a long conversation? Did they sit down? Did they stand up? Was anybody else with James, etc.? Because that's not the kind of thing that Paul is telling about. This is, however, one piece of information that we don't get anywhere else. So how could a maximalist use it? Well, a person I want to focus on here in answering that question is Dale Allison. Now, Allison is what I would think of as a kind of semi-agnostic scholar. He's by no means the most liberal of critical scholars, but he's still what an evangelical would call a liberal scholar. He definitely believes all kinds of things were added to the gospel resurrection narratives and so forth. And he doesn't believe that Jesus appeared bodily to his disciples. He inclines to think that Jesus' body disappeared, maybe like the rainbow bodies of some Tibetan Buddhists disappear, but not that he then went and appeared in his body to the disciples. He's definite that it couldn't have been videotaped or photographed, and he says that he thinks their experiences were visionary in nature. So, where does that put him? I definitely would say he doesn't affirm the bodily resurrection of Jesus, because bodily resurrection would include bodily appearances. He's what you might think of as an objective vision guy, where, it's like God is sending visions to the disciples of Jesus. In some sense, it's outside of their own minds, but it's not physical. Okay, so I've often said that the views of Dale Allison provide a kind of watershed or test case for the kind of case one makes for the resurrection of Jesus. Not that one type of case is going to convince him to change his mind that Jesus was raised bodily and another type of case isn't. We're not talking about psychology here, but we're talking about whether a certain type of case actually is appropriate as an answer to the type of view that Allison takes, and whether it's evidentially getting at the heart of the matter and saying, no, okay, that's where you're assuming something or you're stating something that's incorrect. That's where we need to back up and discuss and debate that, because that then is feeding into these other places where you're disagreeing with the Orthodox Christian view of the bodily resurrection. And it's my opinion that the minimalist approach does not do that well. And it's interesting sometimes to watch Dr. Michael Licona in live discussion with Dr. Allison. and about the conversion of James. I saw a place where they were discussing this. I think it was 2 or 3 years ago, and I don't know if I can find the video again before this is released. If I can, without too much trouble, I'll put a link queued up in the show notes. But it was interesting that Dr. Allison was bringing out his idea that maybe James became part of the Christian movement before he saw an appearance of Jesus risen, and Dr. Licona was kind of surprised and saying no, he thought he was converted by the appearance of Jesus. Well, as far as a conclusion there, I agree with Dr. Licona, but it was interesting that he didn't seem to know exactly how to, push back on that from Dr. Allison. So I hope I'm going to be able to show here a little better why the minimalist has more trouble doing that. In Gary Habermas's most recent book that just came out, there's something very interesting. He cites on page, I think it's 558, the statement that Dale Allison in the 1980s seemed to believe that James was converted by an appearance of Jesus after he rose again. I don't have the exact quote from Allison here. It's accurate from his book that he wrote in the 1980s. It's something like presumably as a result of his seeing Jesus, he was converted. Something like that. So that's accurately quoted. But Dr. Habermas only quotes that and then therefore is saying, hey, this is something that even Dale Allison believes about the conversion of James. And what he doesn't seem aware of is that as early as 2005, Allison had changed his mind on that. Now, I'm going to be reading in a minute here from Allison's 2021 book because it's got a little more about his opinion on the conversion of James. But you can look it up in his 2005 book as well, and he's saying very, very similar things. I'll give the page numbers in the 2005 book in the show notes as well. Sometimes even exact words. It's just a little more expansive here, but it's very clear in the 2005 book that he didn't believe anymore that James was converted by seeing Jesus risen, and that he was saying what he says now, which is, we just can't know. All we have is this bare bones. He appeared to James in 1 Corinthians 15:7, and maybe James became a follower before the appearance to James for all the evidence shows us. What's even odder is that in Dr. Habermas's 2023 book, in a footnote on that same page, it actually gives the page numbers, the very page numbers I'm going to be reading to you here from pages 77 to 79 in Allison's 2021 book. And it just says in the footnote in Habermas something like, Allison also discusses these matters on these pages. Well, when he discusses these matters, he says exactly the opposite from the 1985 quotation that you just gave. So that's quite an oversight. I see I do have the page numbers here in the 2005 book, Resurrecting Jesus, pages 261 to 263. Allison says very similar things. All right, so I'm going to read what Allison says here. Bear in mind that when Dr. Licona argues that James was converted by the appearance, he makes use of a couple things, which I think are legitimate to make use of, but not necessarily if you're trying to stick to, minimalism. One, that the brothers of Jesus are said in Acts chapter 1 to be with the disciples, in other words, apparently part of the movement, along with Jesus' mother, prior to the day of Pentecost. So that's, right there after Jesus has ascended, and prior to Pentecost. And then second, the idea that Paul's list in 1 Corinthians 15 is chronological. As you'll see, though, Allison also thinks it's chronological. So, and that's not enough to make him think that we have reason to believe that James was converted by an appearance. I'll be trying to fill out a little more of what else you need to have and argue for. All right. He first says, my inclination is to suppose that the event, that's the appearance to James, happened too long after Easter to win inclusion in Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John. That's interesting right there. He doesn't say how long, but too long after Easter to win inclusion. All right. And then after a little while, he says, this leaves us with nothing save the bare-boned 1 Corinthians 15:7, then he appeared to James. Apologists, nonetheless, and by the way, the word apologists in Allison is negative. It's definitely a negative word. Have repeatedly made much of it. Defenders of the resurrection are in the habit of emphasizing that it took an encounter with the post-mortem Jesus to turn an outsider into an insider. This is hardly assured. I am reminded of what von Kampenhausen wrote in another connection. In the absence of any evidence, the imagination has the field to itself as wide as it is barren. And what excludes the possibility that James joined the Christian community and only subsequently had a vision of Jesus? So then he gives some possible scenarios. Scenario 2 is James's doubter, Easter Sunday appearance to James, James's follower. Scenario 3, James's doubter, Easter Sunday, James's follower, appearance to James. The many modern writers, he says, who rather favor scenario 2 often do so, one suspects, for the apologetical payoff. That's an accusation. This sequence turns James into Paul. In both cases, a resurrection appearance makes a believer out of an unbeliever. What real evidence, however, requires the second option and excludes the third, or even makes it less likely? So, he's really going to town on that. We don't have any evidence that actually makes it even likely that James was converted by an appearance. The sad truth is that we do not know the circumstances of the appearance to James. We know not where it occurred, nor when it occurred. We cannot characterize James' state of mind at the time, nor determine whether he had already thrown in with the Christian cause. We can say, assuming Paul has his facts straight, that James saw Jesus after Peter did, and so almost certainly after James had learned of others seeing Jesus. So here, Allison is taking the order to be chronological. That bit about after hearing that others had seen Jesus, he's going to take that to be then sort of influencing James somehow. We can further surmise that the experience was a factor in the man's rise to ecclesiastical power. That, however, is about all we can with good conscience, wring from, and then he gives the Greek, he appeared to James. All right, it's pages 77 to 79 in Dr. Allison's 2021 book. What is missing here in Allison's agnosticism about when James had an experience that he claimed was seeing Jesus raised? The ascension. That's what is missing. Now, think about how things fit together better under these circumstances. Suppose we are prepared to argue that the Gospels and Acts give us good evidence of what the original witnesses claimed, and that's like an intrinsic part of our resurrection case. We're prepared to argue for that. We're not assuming it in some question-begging way, but we're prepared to go to bat for that. And that includes the narration of the ascension in Acts 1. Then what we have is the idea that there was a period of time when Jesus was literally physically on the earth after he rose from the dead. His feet would make footprints, as I often say. The light rays bounced off his head. He was seen in a normal way because he was there in a literal body, okay? And that then he left our space-time continuum, that the disciples were there, that they saw this thing where he went up into the sky and poof, he disappeared. And then a couple of men in white, whom they took to be angels, came and said, he'll come back, but later, don't stand staring up into heaven. Okay, so he's gone. And that then when they talk about the fact that he will come back, which they do mention multiple times in the book of Acts, that reflects the fact that they don't think he's physically on earth anymore. He can be spiritually present to us. Stephen sees a vision of him at the right hand of the Father when Stephen's being stoned, or so the story tells us, but he's not walking around leaving footprints anymore, having meals with people, etc. And that the disciples, let's say we take it, that they made a sharp distinction between seeing Jesus before he ascended and any kind of event that happened after he ascended. And that they didn't expect those kinds of experiences from before he ascended to be happening after he ascended, because he's not physically here in our space-time continuum, tangibly like that, okay? That then can be fitted together with other things about Jesus' brother. Okay, so, for example, we find Jesus' brothers with the disciples early in Acts 1, okay, as Dr. Lacona emphasized, but also in 1 Corinthians 15, we find Paul says, after saying he appeared to James, he says, then to all of the apostles. So again, if we take it, as Allison appears to be taking it, that this is chronological, there was at least one other appearance to all the apostles after the appearance to James. Now that fits together really well with James having a physical-like experience prior to the ascension, because as far as we can tell, all of those group experiences that were listed for evidential purposes of convincing people, were pre-ascension. Because, and that makes sense, right? Because it's while Jesus is here on earth that he can appear to a bunch of people in this very literal way, where one person can be standing over here and seeing him from this angle, and one person can be standing over here and seeing and hearing him from this angle. He's 3D, as it were, okay? And a group can interact with him in that normal group-like way. So that appears to be what it means and is referring to in 1 Corinthians 15 about his appearing to the 12. Again, we don't get that just from 1 Corinthians 15, but we get it from the Gospels and Acts 1, right? That he's there with them for a certain period of actual literal time. He's showing himself to them by many proofs, says Acts 1. Okay, so then he appeared to all the apostles appears to be one of those meetings, because there would have been multiples of them during that 6-week approximately period. The appearance to James then comes in the midst of that. If we take 1 Corinthians 15 to be chronological, which I think is justified by the Greek grammar, and in this case, very unusually, Lacona and Allison and I all appear to agree that we're justified in taking it to be listing chronologically. Notice that this makes Paul's appearance the outlier. So Paul says, then he appeared to me also as to one born out of due time. I am the least of the apostles, not worthy to be called an apostle because I persecuted the church. So there's all this, shall we say, mixed feelings that Paul has about his appearance experience, and it seems to have been quite different in kind. He's looking up. The other people aren't seeing and hearing exactly what he's seeing and hearing. They seem to hear something, but there's no notion that Jesus is tangible to Paul at that point, or that they're interacting in this kind of normal way, okay? It appears to be, at least in some respects, more vision-like, far more so than any of the appearances that are reported in detail in the Gospels. Okay, but when James is then being located in amongst these group appearances, it then makes a lot more sense to put that together with the brothers being part of the Christian movement prior to Pentecost, to put that together with James going from being apparently one of the brothers possibly scoffing at Jesus in in the Gospels in a couple different places to being a leader. Now it makes more sense to argue that he actually had a physical-like experience of Jesus, even though we don't get any more specific details. But we do get details in the Gospels of other appearances, and once we get a notion that this is how the early church used this terminology, okay, then it's legitimate to apply that to James. How they use the terminology, how they use the appearances for evidential purposes, and so forth. And it puts James on one side of a gap, on the opposite side from the type of appearance that occurred to Paul. Now, Allison's not going to grant this. In fact, he thinks that's not true. He would disagree with everything I just said about that, I think. We can tell this on pages 260 to 261 in the 2021 book. I've read part of this before. What counts in the end, or so it seems to me, is not the metaphysical or ontological status of the bodily form of the enigmatic post-Easter Jesus, something nobody can know anything about, but the personal identity of the risen one with the crucified Jesus of Nazareth, and the circumstance that, whatever else he seemed to be, he was not an insubstantial ghostly relic, the defeated victim of death. What is the advantage of an interpretation of the resurrection so literal that it forces the conclusion that the risen Jesus retained his kidneys and genitals, had a body full of carbon and oxygen atoms, and sported a material costume? Traditionally, most Christians have believed that at some point Jesus passed into a new mode or sphere of existence. I see no theological deficit in supposing that this happened before he appeared to Mary and Peter. Now, there is no ... after that sneering sentence about having kidneys and a material costume, and the sentence about his passing into a new mode of existence. Okay, there's no gap there on that page. So this statement that he sees no theological deficit, that's scholar speak. That's really what he thinks. Okay, let's not beat around the bush. In that context, Allison is definitely saying, let's mash together the resurrection and the ascension, passing into a new mode of existence, into a new mode or sphere of existence. That's what Orthodox Christians call the ascension. Okay? And Allison's whole point is, well, that happened before any of the any of the appearances. This, by the way, was the view of Pannenberg, I believe, as well. Okay, and it's actually, pretty common. There's an earlier point in the book, which I didn't happen to write down here, where Allison gives some kind of summary of what Christians mean by the resurrection that's so vague, that it would allow that kind of interpretation. I'm like, no, it's, maybe what critical scholars who still think of themselves as believing in Jesus in some sense might think is meant by the resurrection. But Orthodox Christianity has held that he rose physically, he was here for a certain period of time, and then he went away. Okay? And after that, then the appearances would be different in kind. He wouldn't be having meals with people and stuff like that because he went away. So I think that's very clear that that's where the disagreement comes in. And so it's not enough just to point to Acts 1. Even, if you want for whatever reason to take it that that's reliable, Acts is telling the truth at that point. It's not enough even just to argue that the creed in 1 Corinthians 15 is being given in chronological order. You also have to argue that the disciples attested to the ascension, and that when they talked about these group appearances, which is after James in 1 Corinthians 15, he appeared to all the apostles, they were talking about the kinds of things we have in the Gospels, not some kind of, floating figure in the sky or something. Okay? And that's why they used them evidentially. notice too that this means that James's conversion is evidential in nature. Part of the reason that Allison is so unsure about James is that he's assuming that James's conversion could have been unevidential, because to some extent he thinks that the disciples' belief in the resurrection was unevidential. If they thought that Jesus was physically risen, which I think he thinks they did, it was because of their Jewish conception of resurrection as being physical, which they then read into experiences that didn't really justify it with, as he says, good conscience, okay? As he says about our interpretation of the appearance to James. Well, if we're arguing from a maximalist point of view, we're ready to argue that the disciples' conversions were evidential in nature. And then it fits for James's to be evidential in nature as well. I want to just pause and correct any false impression. I'm not saying Paul's appearance and conversion was non-evidential, but what he believed in about Jesus' resurrection was in part because he already knew what the Christians were teaching as he was persecuting them. So when the voice in what must have been a pretty striking, shocking, visionary type experience said, "I am Jesus, whom you are persecuting," that brought with it the idea that Jesus was this person that these people he was persecuting said had risen from the dead. So that there was content that was put into there from that clear attestation of bodily resurrection and also clear attestation of bodily appearances and experiences. Okay? But Paul didn't have that exact same kind of experience. I think James did. And I think we can argue that he did from the placement in order in 1 Corinthians 15, coupled with a maximalist case concerning the attestation to the ascension. So I hope that's been interesting, and I hope it helps those of you who like this type of thing to have an enriched Easter experience this year, if it's something that you haven't thought about before. Jesus is risen. Christ is risen. He is risen indeed in a body, and because he lives, we shall live also in new bodies of our own. The evidence shows that. Thanks for watching. I'm Lydia McGrew.